Hello, Bad Law Project here. I'm Anna Loutfi and I'm going to talk about memorials and the law. I really don't want to talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Not now, not yesterday and not tomorrow. But safe to say that it is an example of a situation, shall we say, which has import for the United Kingdom. It is seen to be, and it is presented as being, across media channels, as incredibly divisive. And safe to say that what divisive may have meant before the culture wars and before social media has a totally different meaning today in 2023. Divisive doesn't mean there's more than one side to the story. Divisive doesn't mean it's complicated. Divisive doesn't mean that there are people with different views which they hold passionately. It doesn't even mean that there are two sides, with both sides committed to a rigid view of their position, which cannot coexist with the other sides. It doesn't even mean that. In 2023, divisiveness carries a violence that is akin to a potential military scenario. We are talking about an incendiary situation as opposed to a polemical debate. We are talking about risk to life as opposed to risk to feelings. Now, it is not unfamiliar territory in the UK at this present time to have seen divisions that appeared on the surface to be rocking the body politic in wholly unprecedented ways. Ways which seem to transcend the right to hold an opinion, the right to articulate a position, the right to have strong feelings about something that's out there in the public political domain. When George Floyd was murdered, back in 2020, it was clear for those of us paying attention in the United Kingdom that although this was on some level a specifically American story about racial segregation and its historical legacy, forms of institutional prejudice that have persisted through the civil rights movement and may exist in some form or another in the modern United States of today. We knew that that wasn't the end of the story, because what was happening post George Floyd was the globalization of an idea that transcended American borders, US borders, and started to be implemented in countries like the United Kingdom as if the United Kingdom shares the same racial history as the United States. The idea that went global after George Floyd was murdered was the idea that there are two species on planet Earth, and they are bitterly irreconcilable. Well, while technically they are both human species, one is black and the other is white. They have nothing in common with each other. They have only known historical enmity. They are committed to the annihilation of the other side. The globalization of Black Lives Matter picked a side, having disseminated this toxic idea that there are two types of human, black humans and white humans, and said that there was no equity between the two sides, because one side had suffered historic injustice and the other side had been the perpetrator of historic injustice. Therefore, whilst it was conceded that relations between black and white, so to speak, were toxic, one side of that argument, as Black Lives Matter argued, was that it was justified to call for the annihilation of white people, or to speak disparagingly about people with white skin, to publish academic books about whiteness as a sort of genetic deficiency. And we should have been paying attention to that in ways that we didn't pay attention to, because whilst we had a lot of discussions about the toxicity of Black Lives Matter, and plenty of people of all colours and all creeds and all religions and all backgrounds had things to say about it, some arguing that Black Lives Matter was actually helpfully drawing attention to historical injustices that still haven't been addressed, and that there was a value to this powerful polemical movement. Others were saying, no, it's simply reductive. It's treating all of the Western nations as if they were 1950s United States, segregation still being practiced then, and black people being disenfranchised. It's applying that kind of historical moment to everywhere as if we're still living in the United States in 1950s. And it's also trying to antagonize people on racial grounds against one another, and it's also ignoring the very positive gains that have been made in the United States, whilst also completely ignoring the different history here in the United Kingdom when it comes to race relations. So there were arguments on both sides, but what nobody really was talking about when Black Lives Matter raised its head, its global head, was the very new kind of incendiary logic that was being perpetrated through the globalization of that movement. We should have been paying attention at the time to a new kind of polemic, which is not just politically divisive, as the Black Lives Matter movement was openly and without any shame promoting a divisive view of the world as divided into black and white classes of people who are historically opposed and will remain opposed until one side wins. That polemic aside, there was genuine incendiary risk embedded in that global idea that there could be real wars generated in any area or territory where that idea was promoted. There ran the risk of being conflict, violence, and criminal damage and whole-scale lawlessness that transcends mere protest. It transcends high feelings. It transcends the idea of let's go out for the day and make our feelings known. Let's carry a banner. Let's petition a public body or a governmental authority or department with our concerns and our grievances. Let's shout. Let's play music. Let's dress up. Let's be heard. Let our voices take over the streets of Berlin or London or New York or San Francisco for the day. That is not what I'm talking about. That is the inherent right to protest that political movements throughout history, from the suffragettes in Britain to the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, have historically had and continue to demand the right to protest, no matter how bad their message, divisive their message, unpopular their message, or potentially divisive. What I'm talking about, and I say it starts with Black Lives Matter in our era, is something which has the capacity to transcend the issues that it purports to be concerned about. I'm talking about if police violence, racialized police violence in the United States was ostensibly the cause of the protests after George Floyd's death, it didn't remain the cause of those protests. The protests became an expression of something else. They had a power that went way beyond any sensible, practical, logistical discussion about how racialized politics plays out in American policing today. The Israeli-Palestine conflict is a similar issue. It has the capacity to transform areas of the world quite remote from Palestine or Israel, or indeed the Middle East. It has the capacity to generate turf wars, gang violence, desecration of buildings, criminal damage, and possibly even mass murder, by the way that it is being taken on as a conflict that is above and beyond its geographical limitations in the Middle East. It exists everywhere, in every country, on every territory. There are only two positions that one can take, and if you take one, you are advocating genocide as far as the other side is concerned. There is no space for pragmatism, quiet, calm, or history. There is no space for debate. The ordinary free speech provisions that we think of when we think of debates about climate change, when we think about debates about schooling, when we think about debates about the immigration question, those sorts of issues, forget them. They have nothing on this issue. Why am I saying all this? What does it have to do with the law? Well, I think that the legislators in this country knew or intuitively felt something of what I'm talking about when they amended the Magistrates' Courts Act 1980 via Section 50 of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022. Now, the amendment ensured that where criminal damage is caused to a memorial, the case can be heard either in the Magistrates' Court or in the Crown Court, a so-called either way offence, if you like. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because it means that criminal damage to a monument potentially, if heard in the Crown Court, could receive a sentence maximum of up to 10 years imprisonment. Now, the reason why the amendment was necessary was because criminal damage under the value of £5,000 would normally, before the amendment, not have attracted more than a 3 months maximum sentence. So why then was this amendment deemed necessary? A very interesting circular by the Ministry of Justice entitled Police Crime Sentencing and Courts 2022, Section 50, Criminal Damage to Memorials and Other Amendments to Criminal Offences, was issued on the 28th of June 2022, on the same date as the amendment was made. And it states that the purpose of the circular was to notify recipients of the new criminal damage provision regarding memorials in the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022, and it gives a little background as to why the amendment is necessary. I'll remind you, the amendment increased potentially the maximum sentence for damaging a memorial. And the background contained in the Ministry of Justice circular states, demonstrations in the summer of 2020, those are the Black Lives Matter protests, saw protesters targeting statues, including war memorials and other commemorations of cultural significance, causing great public concern. On the 7th of June 2020, during the anti-racism protests, the Cenotaph War Memorial on Whitehall was daubed with graffiti, and a protester tried to set fire to the Union Jack flag on the memorial. The statue of Sir Winston Churchill in Westminster was also spray-painted with the words, "Was a racist," under the former Prime Minister's crossed-out name. Now, paragraph 3 of the circular is particularly interesting, and I'd like you to think about what it is saying carefully, because blink and you might miss it. Paragraph 3 of the circular from the Ministry of Justice states, these attacks, referring to vandalism committed during the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020, these attacks sparked significant interest in the topic in the House of Commons. It has long been considered that the law is not sufficiently robust in this area, as, while incidences of damage to and desecration of statues and war memorials are typically of low monetary value, they often carry a high sentimental and emotional impact. I want to just stay with that last sentence. What I understand the Ministry of Justice to be saying, by way of summarising a discussion that has long been going on in the House of Commons and probably came to fruition with the Black Lives Matter protests, is that certain things cannot be monetarily valued. Criminal damage has always been historically a question, in many respects, of what was damaged and how much value, monetary value of damage was caused. But here, we are talking about emotional damage, damage of a sentimental nature or a psychological nature, damage which is caused to a people because collectively those people feel that an act of desecration has been performed on something that it doesn't belong to an individual. It's not like a bicycle or a handbag or somebody's personal property. It has collective significance for a nation, for a people, for a collective. And that has a value, but not one that can be calculated monetarily. And hence the amendment, Section 50 of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022 was deemed necessary in order to instill in law a recognition of the value of monuments and national symbols that cannot be calculated monetarily. And if we go to Section 50 of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, we see a breakdown of the offence into definitions about what it means to speak about a memorial, a building or a structure or anything erected or installed on land or in or on any building or a garden or anything planted or grown which has a commemorative purpose. And that includes, for the purposes of the amendment, any movable thing, such as a bunch of flowers left in, on, or at a memorial for a commemorative purpose. This raises the question of flags. On Saturday or Sunday of the weekend, Lawrence Fox was in central London and a friend called him to tell him that a flag had been placed on a statue at Westminster Pier. The statue of Boadicea and her daughters, erected in 1902, sculpted and designed by engineer and artist Thomas Thornycroft, depicting Boadicea, the queen of the Iceni Celts, who died in battle after leading her people against the Roman invaders. Now, this statue forms part of a panoply of statues which have, on the face of it, very little in common. If you go to that part of London, you will see the infamous statue of Sir Winston Churchill, formerly daubed racist, and the reason for the amendment that I discussed. You will see statues of Mahatma Gandhi, the patron saint, if you will, of Indian independence from the British Empire or the British Raj. You will see Millicent Fawcett, the suffragette who led her sisters in struggle for the vote in the early 20th century. So I think it's safe to say that these are statues which reflect very different moments of history and very different political causes and very different ideas about the world and very different individuals. What they all have in common, including Boadicea and her daughters, is that they have some sort of emotional significance for the British. They reflect a collective people known as the British people. And when Lawrence's friend called him, she said they've put a flag on Boadicea's statue, and that flag was the Palestinian flag. And according to people who were there were flags all over the place at Westminster, including flags on other statues as well. So I suppose what I'm trying to ask is, why was this allowed to happen? Because when Lawrence was told that this flag had been put up there, he decided that it ought to be brought down, given that there was a complete lack of policing attention to the activities of placing the flags on the statues, but also to the potentially incendiary nature of placing those flags there at this critical time in history. Had the police taken those flags down and told the people putting those flags on those monuments to jog on, or stronger, that would have been a de-escalation of the incendiary tension that I sense building in my city. But they didn't. They allowed an act of desecration, multiple acts of desecration, to take place. And of course, as predicted, people felt hurt. They felt wounded. They felt their collective identity attacked. They felt that there was something going on here that transcended a defense of the Palestinian people and felt more like an attack on the British people. And we know that some people in this country take that to heart very, very deeply indeed. I may not be speaking to you right now, but you should be aware that there are plenty of people, many of them seated in the House of Commons, responsible for drafting the amendment to the Magistrates' Courts Act so that we could indeed value, on some level, our own collective monuments. Those people, and the people in the country up and down who may not be particularly invested in Mahatma Gandhi or Millicent Fawcett or Boadicea and her daughters, but they do see those statues collectively and the place where they are located as emblematic of a national story. When the police let this happen, they were turning a blind eye to the law. And what happened then was that a space was created, a strange space where an act of desecration posed a question to the people on standby, the bystanders, if you will, the onlookers, the observers. It begged a question. If the police are going to stand there or disappear or wander away or turn their heads away to the planting of a foreign flag on each of these symbolic statues, it begs a question, doesn't it? What is anyone going to do about it? If not the police, then who? It cannot stand like this. It cannot be left that way. That is precisely the point of a desecration. It has to be cleaned up. You don't have vandalism in a Jewish cemetery. You don't have vandalism of the front face of a mosque. You don't have rubbish thrown or pushed through a black family's letterbox with racially aggressive messaging and expect people to leave it that way. It has to be cleaned up. The memory of the desecration has to be erased so that the status quo can be restored. So it begs a question, doesn't it, if you put flags on these statues, of what is going to be done to restore the status quo? And if the police won't take that position, which they are mandated to by law, then who? So all that happened was that Lawrence Fox found a handy stepladder at a local kiosk and was able to shin up it onto Boadicea's statue and remove at least one of the offending flags. Unfortunately, the ladder was removed whilst he was up there, but he was successfully able to return to the ground. It's quite a big statue, so it was no small athletic feat. And he did return to the ground with the flag to cheers from onlookers. My question is this. The conflict that we have seen escalating in the Middle East, as I've said, has the potential to be incendiary well beyond its borders. It has the capacity to be incendiary in every part of the world. It is more than divisive. It is military. It divides people into military armies. It calls for the annihilation of the other. It is so incendiary that our leaders, our lawmakers and our law enforcement are under a moral obligation at this juncture to de-escalate where they can. to not engage in partisan activities, whether by participating in a partisan fashion or refusing to enforce the law when people desecrate national monuments, for example, which could only, in the current climate, be considered highly incendiary. Why are they not doing it? And my final point, if we hadn't had lawmakers in Parliament go to all the trouble of reviewing the Magistrates' Court Act and drafting the Police Crime and Sentencing Act, and then thinking about the debate that had been ongoing, not least since 2020, about the value of national memorials. And they went to all this trouble, and we had the amendment, and we've got Section 50, and the Ministry of Justice published a circular about it. And they went to all of that trouble to make sure that there was, in law, concretely a value placed on certain symbols of Britishness. What was the point? What was the point of that law? If laws are going to be drafted purely to decorate the bookshelves of Westminster and gather dust, then I really don't understand what the point of law is at all. And so I would ask all of us to reflect on the non-monetary value of certain installations in our cities, to respect the fact that others are going through complicated emotions and will express those emotions as they have the democratic right to do in protest on our streets, but that the desecration of British monuments in Britain is not acceptable. And that is what our lawmakers thought when they drafted Section 15 of the Act I've been discussing today. So that's my thought for the week, and I hope that it is food for thought and that you found it interesting. Thank you very much.